Okay. Welcome. My name's Joel. I'm one of the co-founders of the Holon Institute. For those of you who are new to us and what we're doing, we are a education and advisory organization dedicated to co-creating the conditions necessary to actualize human creativity and imagination. And the reason is because we're living in an era of massive separation and disruption change. But this idea of being disconnected from ourselves, from others, from the earth is really rampant and I think endemic to the challenges that we're facing as a species, as a society. And our work is very much oriented around mending that separation. And so, how do we do that? There's a chain of concepts that we call emergent possibility through embodied imagination. And this chain of concepts is both the kind of that how and the what of our work in many ways. And the OmniPotential series that you are now joining us for, this is episode 4, we've been going through each word individually and speaking to each of these concepts and unpacking them. Why is this an important concept? And today we're speaking about embodiment and what it means to be embodied. And this is a really fundamental and keystone concept. And we're very excited to have the unique honor of sharing time with Dr. Hilary McBride as our special guest today to explore this with us. Dr. McBride is a registered psychologist, researcher, podcaster, and has deep expertise, including working with trauma and trauma therapies, embodiment, especially at the intersection of spirituality and mental health. In addition to the teaching and therapy and publishing research, she's also the author of 2 books. Her first book, Mothers, Daughters, and Body Image, Learning to Love Ourselves as We Are. Fantastic book if you've not read it. And her best-selling book, more recently, The Wisdom of Your Body, Finding Wholeness, Healing, and Connection Through Embodied Living. Definitely get yourself a copy. It's a really profound read. And her next book is called Holy Hurt, and it's really about understanding and healing from spiritual trauma specifically, and that comes out next April of next year. And by the way, if you want an early glimpse at some of the probably the ideas and the themes of that book, check out her podcast by the same name, as well as her award-winning podcast, Other People's Problems. So there's a lot of content out there, great material, really helpful. And it goes without saying that Hillary has a really prolific body of work around this subject, no pun intended. And it's been a gift to me. It's been a gift to countless others. We're so pleased to have you, Hillary. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Joel. It feels so good to be with you and all of you, talking about one of my favorite things in the whole world, how to be a body.
Maybe we start there. And is there something that perhaps you could invite us into to begin by stepping into being a body rather than thinking about being a body?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that. It's one of my things, my criticisms about the way that we are becoming more aware of the need to talk about embodiment is that we might still be in the talking about embodiment phase, when actually what we need to do is move beyond that into the whole idea of the concept, which is actually experiencing what it's like to be a body. And I think that talking about it is helpful, especially if we've lived in this really cognitively oriented way of being in the world, that using what we know and what we have is like a great starting point, and there's actually something beyond us for that. So I want to take us on a little tour, so to speak, of moving towards being embodied. And I want to invite all of you to just bring your hands out in front of you if you're able to do so. And just again, become aware of your dominant and non-dominant hands. I invite you to take your non-dominant hand. So for me, that's my left hand, in your dominant hand, and just kind of like hold it in front of you like that. And I want you to hold it in such a way that you hold the things in your life. You hold your phone, you hold your mouse, you hold your keys, right? Hold it like a thing. You don't have to be precious about it. It's just a piece of flesh, just some bones and a skin bag. That's all it is. And actually just like kind of poke it a little bit, prod it a little bit, allow it to become just flesh, just an object or a thing. You might squeeze it, like investigating the texture of your skin, maybe like sometimes like just poking it a little bit or like flop it around. Like it's just a thing, right? Treat it like a thing for a second. As you're doing that, I'm just kind of investigating it in the same way that, I might be like, "Oh, it's actually, oh, whatever, like, whoa, whoa, cool, there's a plug in the bottom." You're just kind of like treating it like a something. And as you do that for just a moment, you can have a little fun with it too. Like, "Oh, I've never done this before. Oh, I've never done that before." Um, allow it to be limp and floppy. You're not letting your non dominant hand participate. It's kind of like it's receiving the treatment of being an object. And as you do that, take a moment to notice how that feels. Take a moment to notice if there's anything different about that than you're used to, or if you're like, just a regular Wednesday for me, treating my body like an object, like that might actually feel really familiar for you. Or maybe there's a kind of like a yucky quality or like a playful quality to this. Like, so be curious about emotion as you're doing this, like just holding, treating this non dominant hand like a thing, noticing how your body tells you that you feel that way. If there's a yuck, if there's a neutrality, if there's nothing foreign about this at all, what tells you that? Okay, and then I invite you to do whoop, shake it out. You're gonna shift the energy. Maybe there's a yawn, a stretch, a drink, like switch it up somehow. And we're gonna take our dominant hand in our non-dominant hand. And I want for you to allow yourself to imagine that all of your life force energy flows right out of your heart, right out of your belly, all the way down your shoulder and into your hand. And your hand is alive itself. So let your fingers move in a way that feels like it's expressive of who you are, how you feel right now. Maybe you feel like this today, or maybe you feel like this today. Maybe you feel like this today. Like allow something of the features of what it means to be you inhabit the quality of the movement of your hand. So here in this moment, you are actually not moving your hand is moving itself. You are moving yourself. You are your hand. What we're practicing here is moving from body as object to body as subject, body as place of aliveness, of creativity, of being. And as you do that, notice that there's like other kinds of feelings that emerge for you, like, oh my gosh, I'm not used to this, or oh, this feels really good, or it feels playful, or I haven't done that before, or oh, this feels better. So just be curious as you're staying with this. You're investigating your hand. And there might be some temptation to stop, to do something different, to assume the exercise is over because you're kind of past that threshold of what you're used to tolerating in terms of like free movement, even just when it comes to your hands. So just a little bit longer if you can. Noticing, what does your hand want to do now? What's something you haven't done before, ever? Maybe with your hand, a shake, a kind of movement, a pattern. There's something that also you have a sense might feel good, like massaging your own hand, like, oh, that feels good. And I actually know that I want that. So take a moment to notice what feels good, what you want. If you can stay with this just a few seconds longer than you might normally, paying very close attention to what it feels like inside to be giving this kind of movement or contact with yourself this much attention. Okay. And permission to keep doing this the whole time. If you're like, there's something here for me, like, great, you got what you came for. But if you want to close the exercise here, you're welcome to. And I just want to put again names to what it was that we were doing there. There's a few different ways of relating to ourselves as bodies. And one of them is body is a thing, right? And we can think of our bodies as the things that we care for, things that we tend to, things that we nurture, things that support is our expression of ourselves in the world. But what we often forget is this other way of being, which is our body as being itself, our body as us. Our body is the place where aliveness happens. And we call this body a subject. These are concepts that come from Merleau-Ponty, Jean-Paul Sartre, and like all of these French philosophers and psychologists who really moved forward the conversation on embodiment and reminded us that although treating our body as a thing can sometimes be helpful, there's also limitations to that. And there's these whole other ways of experiencing and encountering our bodies that bring us into more aliveness and wholeness. So I'll leave it there. Practice, man.
Yeah, that's really lovely. I mean, I'm experiencing this thinking there's a lot of things that my hands haven't done. and almost thinking about my hand as having a life and having had life experiences of some types and others of not other kinds. Like I was thinking about music and playing an instrument with my hands. So to your first point around thinking and speaking about embodiment
Mhm.
rather than the practice of being a body as a way, as a door to walk through into this concept, is there a way that you would coach us on processing that experience in a embodied way rather than
Mhm.
a purely cognitive or intellectually reflective way?
Yeah. It's helpful here to remember that mind as an emergent phenomena that comes usually from interpersonal experiences and from the body. Like there will be some cognition at some point, especially if we're staying with the body, but that actually all the thoughts that we have usually have some sort of location within our
Mhm.
somatic self. That's that emergence from what we experience on a felt level. Even our wishes and wants, our ideas about why we decided to do something actually have somatic origins. But I think maybe if we were to bridge it from like this into kind of like processing, I might say that sensation that emerges usually in the core of who we are is really important data about what something is like for us.
Mm,
Or even we call this interoceptive awareness. I think it's one of the keys of embodiment. Interoception is our capacity to sense the inner world of our body. So
mm,
we often think about senses as being these contact points between our body and the world, right? Vision, hearing. This is like a bridge between everything, right? And kind of breaks down the divide between where I end and where you begin and what's happening. But then there's also this entire terrain, this landscape of sensation inside of us that tells us something is about us, about what it feels like to be us, about who we are, about who we've been. And so my suggestion around processing an experience like this, and not a strictly intellectual way just yet, would be what sensations emerge in response to that practice. Did I notice as I was doing the kind of body as object thing that I had like a kind of repulsion? I wanted to pull myself back a little bit. I felt, okay, my neck started to do something. And if I was to make a sound, it would be like, "Ugh," there's like a kind of disgust quality to it. Okay, that tells me something. Whereas when I went the other way, I had that ooh feeling, right? I'm feeling drawn in. There's like a sense of something opening and it being mysterious and playful and maybe a little bit scary. So I could feel something like buzzing in my body. Right? Noticing the quality of sensation first, I think is a really important step before doing meaning making, before doing like the kind of insight building about something, just to get more data and maybe get closer to the phenomenology of the experience itself.
yeah, I love that. Why do you think, maybe zooming out just a little bit,
Mhm.
is this maybe so let me put a question here together because you're using some language that I think is really interesting. Even the word sensation, right? Instead of thought or insight and being present with the sensation before and as a way of extending hospitality to the experience before the intellectual processing. Is there something about what we learn in that sensation presence that is a piece of what's drawing people to embodiment today? And I guess maybe if I had to ask it a different way, is what is it about the rise of embodiment and somatics that you think people are really drawn to over the last
Mhm.
20 years or so? What is it about our cultural, social context that has led to what seems to be a fairly strong desire to recognize new sensation, to be present with that sensation? You've also seen the growth of somatics as a modality of therapy, as well as things like meditation, yoga, other movement-based modalities of healing. What's happening and why is this becoming more regarded and explored and embraced?
Depending on the nature of the conversation, I might answer that differently because I'm having these kind of like mystical, transpersonal musings about this, like as if there's a tipping point that we've reached about how
Mm,
much our disembodiment works for us. And there's
mhm,
an instinctual knowing that there has to be a kind of reorganizing of the way that we are in life to flourish, to actually just be sustainable as beings, that there's an inner sense, maybe on a collective level, that what the way we've been with ourselves isn't working anymore. So I have a query about how things like that happen in the collective unconscious. But I would say if I look at it more sociohistorically, I think about the development of resources and information and data related to trauma
Mm.
coming out of the Vietnam War. We had in the early movement of psychotherapy in westernized contexts, we actually had quite a bit of, there was like some really prescient or like nascent ideas about somatics being important for our integration and our healing that are seen really early on in the work of Darwin, of Freud, of Jung, of the early psychoanalytic society. Like, even I think about William James, and like the field of trauma didn't emerge in the 70s, but it got displaced for a little while. It was there in the 1800s and the early 1900s. But with the Vietnam War, the kind of codifying of the criteria of PTSD, with novel approaches being needed, and us realizing people are not getting better when we ask them to think differently about their trauma. There's an awareness that trauma does not just live in the narratives, right? Our narratives are actually supplied by our autonomic nervous system, which is saying it's not over yet. There's a timelessness to the way that our bodies hold on to trauma in a way that I think really highlights these mismatches in our perception of reality, that I'm here and now and I'm a grown up, and yet why do I feel 5 years old, or why does it feel like the trauma is happening again? And there's some sort of mismatch in my orientation to time, to space, and how I'm conceptualizing what it means to be a person, that is asking us to see that there's more going on than just what we think about the present moment. That there's also this body of memory,
Yeah.
including individual memories, like intercultural memory, I think intergenerational memory, that is saying this needs some attention. And at some point, I think this happens on an individual level and a collective level, that bodies, when we suppress their knowing for long enough, will not go quietly. When we suppress the knowing of bodies, have enough wisdom as nature itself to resist the imposed structures on them, to actually at some point say, like, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to get loud enough. I'm going to get big enough in my wisdom to orient you towards healing, that I'm going to break through
Mm.
the rigid story you're telling about me as being bad or not having anything valuable to offer. And bodies, I think, as an expression of nature themselves, know how the tree bends towards the light. Bodies know how to say, listen to me.
Mm.
And so I think that happens in our own individual histories. And I think that happens in a collective way as well.
I love that metaphor of the body being a tree bending for the light. What are we bending around?
Mhm.
What is it socially or systemically that we're having to bend around? That the body is saying, no more, uh,
Mhm.
no longer, listen to me. Um, Maybe what in your mind, what are you seeing as some of those things?
Yeah. I think that there's a mix of like social constructions as they exist on ideological level that shape the very real, tangible structure of how we live our lives. And I think that looks a lot of different ways. But I think some of the things that we're bending around are like mistrust of the body, the idea that the body is not worth listening to, that it's unruly, that it's a liability, that it will be overwhelming, it will take over in a way that makes us non-rational, uncredible, makes us too wild, unproductive. Like, not, I think maybe even this idea that if we are in control of and subdue the body, then we can perform better at the tasks of a society that wants to treat our bodies like objects, as machines that produce. And to bend around that, there's a lot there's a lot in there that I could say, but I just think that we have these like these stories that have actual historical origins, that they come from, where there are places and times and people and movements, political movements, theological movements, ideological, and even academic thought, that we can trace a lot of this back to. So there's these kind of like systemic things that exist and are pervasive in our society that I think for some very good reasons have existed to either keep people safe or give them power, right? Often power and safety are two things that go along with some of these things that inhibit us in our body, or things, maybe a better way of saying that, disembody us. That there has been, I think it's important to name some real social advantages to being disembodied up
Mm,
to a certain point, where people have been rewarded socially for having mastery over their body. Like, I have a patient of mine who's an elite athlete at a world level and at a global level, and has said, like, my disembodiment has gotten me so much praise.
right.
This has been the thing that people say, wow, you are so brave. You're so brave. And yet people don't really know what it's cost me. It's cost me my entire self, but it looks so compelling. It looks
Mhm.
incredible. In fact, there's accolades and like praise and the idea of belonging. And then I think there's the other side of it too, which is it's incredibly hard to grapple with the complexity of being a body. And when we have these very thin views of suffering, of existence, of what it means to exist,
Mm,
like the thin views don't really allow for the complexity of a body that holds pleasure and pain, that holds like all of it, aliveness and death. And so we have these very disembodying experience, the stories, like cultural scripts and myths and practices to keep us from our body, likely because being in the body is not something that we've been supported to know how to be with. That includes trauma, pain, objectification, incarceration. If we just make all of it go away,
right.
then we don't have to deal with the reality that I'm free and you're not. We don't have to deal with the reality that I feel so alive and I'm going to die, or I have pain and my body is this incredible source of pleasure. Like, it's just, the body is like anima mundi, like it's the all. It's
Mm,
the all. And
mhm,
it's very hard to be with the all in a culture that wants like
mhm,
black and white narratives for how to be good and how to have
mhm,
power and how to be safe.
mhm. Sounds like there's many justified reasons for being disembodied, and that there are systems that incentivize disembodiment, and we
Yeah.
reward disembodiment. So whether it's high performance as an athlete or a person deep in hustle and grind culture, or it's somebody responding to trauma and trying and essentially their body protecting them from
Mhm.
chronic trauma in some way or another. There's many reasons why, both good and bad.
Mhm.
Uh, as we step towards embodiment then, from either of those vectors, what's the first thing that people should begin to do? And is it the ability to hold some of these tensions and paradoxes? Do we need to cultivate a capacity and practice around the non-duality of the pain and the pleasure and all the other things
Mhm.
that you were saying? Or what's the first step?
Mhm. So, because there are as many experiences of being or body as there are people, it's really hard to give a kind of unified
Totally.
next step. But I think maybe if I was to be pressed in one way, I would say, as informed by the trauma work that I do, I would say that recognizing our disconnection
Mm,
on an individual and a systemic level is actually probably the first place to start. And it's a very strange thing to think about in this way, but dissociation, we might call that dissociation or disembodiment, this fragmentation between awareness and body, that maybe even the complete refusal or the resistance to be connected to the body, disavowal, all the way to like nothingness, blankness, right? Some people, when you ask them, and this might be the case for some of you listening to the conversation, when we say, what's happening in your body? It's like, what does that mean? I don't understand that question. Where do I begin to go looking for what's inside? I don't even know, like, you're asking me to speak a language I don't speak. So when we think about it from a trauma perspective, because I think there's trauma is at the root of a lot of disembodiment, whether it's cultural, intercultural, intergenerational trauma and our survival strategies, or specific individual lived experience of being so overwhelmed we can't tolerate being in the body, and our things like the neurocognitive processes just to disconnect unconsciously. To make the nothing something is always the first place to start, right? To make the nothing something means that we become aware of what we've been unaware of. And what we're often unaware of is how much we are not connected, how much we are missing, how much we don't have access to. And to really just start by going, I have to believe on some level that there's something inside of myself that I have been groomed to not feel,
Mm,
allows us to make the not feeling something we become aware of, even if we don't know what the specificity of it is. The ability to go, okay, there's probably some blankness there. There's probably some loss of contact. And I'm going to assume that's the case, even if I can't quite put my finger on it yet. Or to say, wow, this is a systemic wide, this is a culture wide phenomenon. This is a family thing. Whoa, like nobody in my family knows how to do this. Or wow, in cultures of whiteness, whoa, we don't know how to do this. Or wow, like in academia, wherever it is that we draw a circle around our identity, we might ask ourselves, like, how is the body not allowed here? And
mm,
simply by allowing ourselves to name how it's not allowed or how it's been forbidden or displaced or dislocated, we start to make awareness where there wasn't awareness. And that's usually a good place to start with a lot of things. And then I think after that, there can be like, this comes from, I'm thinking about the Vygotsky's social or learning theory zone of proximal development idea. Like whenever we're learning something and we're stretching ourselves, we need to figure out like how much can we tolerate around stretching and what's our capacity to engage in something. And if we have very good reasons to not be in the body, then it's not going to be very compelling for us to flood ourselves with sensation to the point that we're overwhelmed and we dissociate again. Like that doesn't usually lead to us feeling safer in our body. So we might think about like incremental sensing or even incremental cognitive shift that feels like within our capacity to feel like we have some mastery, like a stretch with qualities of mastery to it, including what if I changed my story about my body? What if I made space in my day to pause and notice what I was feeling? And just thinking about like, what if I was to turn a bunch of handles to connect with myself, which one opens the easiest that I'd be most likely to walk through? And that will probably be different for all of us, but might include, like you're saying, some of these like non dual, maybe more complex
mm.
ideas about being.
Yeah. I think that the making nothing something is really a great way of just summarizing that concept of just becoming aware and naming that question, how is the body not allowed here? And naming those things, I think is really powerful. For those who have become aware to some degree, but are still very much saturated in a system that is not conducive to acting on the awareness. Liz had a great question in the chat. How do you live with that awareness, the wisdom of this reality and the wisdom of your body and listening to your body, but you still exist? How do you still exist productively enough in a society to support yourself and have some sense of freedom in this world? So it's that being productive, overcoming maybe. So, for example, a very tangible thing for me would be like tiredness. Like I know I have to
Mhm,
get up. My body says no, but I say
mhm,
yes. I need to say no to what my body is telling me it wants to get up and get the kids ready for school and out of the house and all that. You know what I mean? That kind of stuff. There's this very interesting tension there. How do you
mhm.
walk that tension, live in that space?
I love this question so much because I think it allows us to take embodiment beyond maybe the initial assumption that we have, which is when we're embodied, we just do, we follow whatever impulse we want. And then we've arrived at embodiment. Do whatever you feel like, go masturbate in your car at lunch or go eat the whole cake or do whatever you want. You're embodied now. And that's actually not, doesn't really allow us to be in relationship with the world that we're in and to like have maturity in our relationship to ourselves. So I think that the two ideas that come to mind in response to this question are one, I think of us as having a multiplicity. It's actually to consider the self as having many voices that kind of act like a choir, like my voice, when you hear Hillary's voice, does not come from a singularity inside. It actually comes from like a choir, like parts of me that when they sing together, they create the song of being Hillary in the world. And that sometimes, as we know, so many of you who've probably heard a choir, you're like, oh, that person, that alto singing real loud in front. We want to turn down the volume. Some of the voices, especially if it feels like they're out of pitch or they're not working with what the song the choir is singing. And this actually, you might be familiar with internal family systems theory, like the parts work is lots of a big part of that. But I think actually even before that, in the 70s and 80s, a Jewish feminist scholar named Dr. Carol Gilligan started talking about the multiplicity of self as being a feminist concept that often when we are in a position of having less social power, we develop multiple voices because who am I around dictates which voice I use. If I'm in the room, this is also standpoint theory. If I'm in the room with someone who's a lot more power than me, I'm a different voice to people. So no, that's definitely a part of me I developed. But then I'm with people who I feel like I'm safe with, and all of a sudden you get to see this other side of me. Like, oh, there's that voice that feels unafraid and wants to speak. So this is also about negotiating power. All of this to say, I think that when we start to develop a relationship of noticing our body, that we can start to notice multiplicity in the body. So yes, there is a I'm tired. I don't want to get out of bed. But I bet if we are listening long enough and deep enough and we go looking for it, there is also a somatically anchored knowing that says, I love my kids. I love seeing them in the world.
Mm.
And I want to support them to live in a way that actually meets the demands of life and teaches them to be in the world. And that is in our bodies too. So it's not, I can't think of a better example than this, but last night I was eating all these Halloween candies and I was like, we're carving pumpkins as a family. And you eat something like particularly a candy, a Halloween candy, and you're like, whoa, there's like a strong flavor right off the nose. And you stay with it a little bit longer. You're like, oh, there's something else there. We can sense inside of ourselves like that too. Tired is like right there on the surface, but underneath it is, I really love my job, or I really love the feeling of mastery of knowing I accomplished something. Okay, so that's the first thought in response to this. The second thought is that we are in relationship with ourselves. And the way that we talk about this clinically is self referencing speech. And that's just a way of saying, like, how do I talk to my body? How do I talk to myself as a self? If I see my body as being this obstacle, my body won't get out of bed. It's I am my mind, and my body is this thing that's this barrier to living. What would happen if we changed the quality of our self-referencing speech to believe that our body is a voice worth listening to, is telling us something, even if we don't know what it's telling us. And sometimes when we stay with that sense from our body long enough, we keep going back to it. What our body has been saying this whole time is this system that I live in is so unjust. It's so wrong that the cost of living is so high and money is this whole way of how to orient my life. And I have to work so hard in order to like, there is something wrong about that. And this resistance is my body's way of saying this isn't compatible with living. And so when we stay with that sensation as a voice we're listening to over time, sometimes we realize like it's saying something about the environment we're in. It's also saying maybe something about our past. Maybe it's saying something about what we want. And then I think in relation to this, I mean, becoming a parent really showed me so much of how to do this differently. But I remember this one experience of my daughter who did not like being in the car, had a really hard time being in the car when she was young. And there was this point where it was like, I'm never going to drive again. I'm never going to drive again. Because she's like screaming. It's like so awful. My heart is breaking. I don't know what to do with this level of distress, but also like, groceries. We're like, we're to go to the doctor. So we start to develop these ways as parents of being with our kids in their distress. And I remember saying to my daughter one time, she was like 6 months old or something. So language, probably not accessing, but quality of my voice and knowing, I really believe that kids can feel and sense from us. So I was just saying to her, like, I am hearing your no. You do not want to be in the car right now. And we do have to be in the car, but you can keep telling me how much you don't like this. Like, don't stop telling me. As long as you don't like this, you can keep telling me about that. We will get in the car, but you don't ever have to stop communicating to me what you feel inside. And that to me felt like, oh, that's what we're trying to do with embodiment. That's what we're trying to do in the challenges of living that our bodies, I don't like this. And we're like, you have to go away. Don't talk to me anymore. And actually what we need to be doing is saying, oh, you can keep telling me that. You can keep telling me this doesn't feel good. We're going to go for right now. We're going to keep going because this is what life is asking of us right now. But but keep telling me. I want to know.
Mm.
And there is something about healing that relationship inside of ourselves that I think creates enough trust to actually then begin to tolerate the I don't like it. And we can start to make more nuanced choices instead of like just not doing something because we don't like it or doing something because we really like it. Well, oh, I want that, but I can hold that wanting even if I can't get it. Or I don't like that, but I can do it anyway because I know how to be with myself in that. And all of this is about how we are in relationship with sensation, with the reality of our body's voice.
I love that. Yeah, that's really good. Thank you for Chris dropped a question here that I think is really interesting. A lot of the conversations we've been having, both for just the simple pleasure and joy of the conversation, because the topic is fascinating, but also because we think that there's something here conceptually that is emerging into a more widely embodied experience and truth, which is this idea that while we are bodies, we are also a part of a body, a bigger body,
Mhm.
right? It all just depends on perspective, and that whether you zoom all the way out to universal scale or you zoom all the way into the subatomic, that there's a scaffolding and a holonic structure to reality, and that our physical self in this form we often think of as the body, but we've also ascribed the body identity to other scales, right? Mother Earth, right? Gaia, we use these kinds of terms. And there's the collective body, right? We say the body of people or the body of work or the body, there's a collective aggregate body as well. And in some cases, that collective aggregate body is in some ways, so there's the whole panpsychic theory of consciousness as something that is a universal constant that we tune into, right? And this might explain why there's a murmuration culturally of sorts where you see unconnected people operating in connected ways around the world. Um, and so I'm just curious if maybe that sparks or provokes a thought or reflection or an insight into how we orient to the collective body as a body. And what does that mean? Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Mhm. Thank you for that question. What I love about embodiment is that it can take us in all of these directions. Like it can take us into, I want to heal my own personal trauma, and therefore I'm going to create integration within the system in myself. And for some people, embodiment is perceived of as an individual experience, like a solo journey, so to speak. And yet, what's happening is it's like there's a remembering inside of ourselves that I think can't help but be replicated outside of us. Like, I think all of these experiences of joining start to happen, what we might say in therapy language, in a parallel process way that we can't do this. Like, imagine like maybe mind, body, or awareness and sensing self. Like, we can't do this kind of connection without it also immediately translating to this kind
Mm,
of connection, that
mhm,
those are parallel in a way. And so we can take this conversation from, okay, how does someone do integration after the acute effects of the neurophysiology of the traumatic stress response? Okay, what do we actually do to create hemispheric integration? All the way to how does embodiment become this pathway to interpersonal connection, to transpersonal connection? And I think that there's something really, it brings to mind a story. Like I want to bring it back into my body and the felt sense in my body of all of this, which is around the time of the pandemic, there was a really big shift for me personally, as I imagine for all of us, in terms of the lifestyle that I was living and the way that I spent my time. And I don't think I'd realized up until that point, but I was like so excited about these things that I was doing. I was always on a plane. I was always like going somewhere and working on a project. And then all of a sudden, like life landed and I was meeting myself in a way that I hadn't met in a few years. And I think what I was needing was like, oh, I'm uncomfortable with this stuff, or oh, there's that memory that I haven't been wanting to feel, or like the slowing down really brought me in contact with things inside of myself I hadn't wanted to feel, that I hadn't known I hadn't wanted to feel. That's like the making the nothing something again. Like all of a sudden, I was seeing the avoidance, and avoidance loves to throw an invincibility cloak over itself. So I was seeing and feeling like, oh, there's a lot in here. But what I noticed happened is as I was seeing and feeling, I was spending more time in my garden because I was like, oh, I'm around. Oh my gosh, look at those tulips. Oh, whoa. And there was a sense of I was responsive, not just to the sensation inside of myself, but I was responsive to the qualities of the body of the earth. Because as I was sensing more, I would notice like, oh, my mood is different in different seasons. Or, oh, when I'm in the garden, I actually, oh, my shoulders drop. Wow. So I'm feeling like I'm in relationship to the earth. And then what would happen is like I just started to feel like I had a relationship with this piece of land that I live on and the trees. And I would start to feel like, oh, they were teaching me things about like nature and the way that I am nature and the way that we're not so different. Like I remember breastfeeding my daughter one day and then going outside and picking an apple from my apple tree and taking a bite out of it and having this realization like those are the same thing,
Mm.
right? Mama's giving her body to her kiddos, right? Oh, it's I'm the apple tree and it's feeding me and I'm the kid. And like all of these categories started to break down, but it didn't come without me facing my pain inside of myself. And it didn't come without me facing the pain, I think, around me. I became much more sensitized to how disconnected we are from land, the problem of that, of the pace of the way that we were living and the systemic influence on that. So I think I just want to return back to what I said at the beginning, which we in my discipline talk about as parallel process, that if everything is like iterations of everything else, that all of these experiences of body are replicated at many levels, large and small, that when we make this change to bring connection, to remember, right, to bring things back into membership with each other, that because life replicates life at all of these levels, that can't help but influence up and down and back and forward and here and there and me and you and everything, even time scale forward and back, I think. And that to me feels really hopeful because it allows multiple points of entry into healing. It allows us to feel like, oh, my connection to my own body actually is doing something to repair the wounds of colonization. Oh, connection to my body actually will allow me to be in hard conversations about race and genocide and whatnot. Oh, this actually is this connection here can supply and be a part of all other kinds of connection.
I really love that. I feel that. Thank you for that. One last question here in the chat, and then I think we'll wrap up with your final offering for us today. But Becca asks, any tips for those of us who are hypersensitive? I sometimes wish I could turn down the volume like my body is shouting at me.
Mhm. Yeah. I think I'm just aware of even things like neurodivergence and the way that different nervous systems tolerate sensation and speak in sensation in different ways. And I love to think about this as not just an individual like problem to solve, but actually like a social thing to think about. I wonder what would happen if we were more aware of sensation and more choice around people's levels of comfort and preference so that it didn't feel like that was a solo thing to have to manage. So I feel the grief of that just being like, oh, I have to be with the loudness on my own. And I wonder about what we have some research to suggest is like tolerating the loudness becomes easier with connection, right? So sometimes bringing people into that, even like attachment work can sometimes be helpful. Actually, quite literally pulling people close to us can sometimes be helpful. Sometimes becoming better aware of sensation when it's not yelling, when it's, like the volume is turned down and we feel ourselves like moving towards overwhelm with sensation or overstimulation. So noticing the nuance of things, I think can be helpful. Being able to create periods of maybe neutral activation or like being sensory neutral in a way. And I love when Merleau-Ponty talks about, he has a bunch of different ways of categorizing what it means to exist. And one of them is like the body is temporal, the body has time. And when we think about embodiment, again, I know that there can be an instinct sometimes to, I want to do it perfectly in a moment. as if all we have is the singularity of right now to be like, I'm supposed to be perfectly embodied and totally attuned and meet all my needs, but somehow have good boundaries and know what to do with this and talk to myself about it all right now in the span of this 1 hour. And when we remember that our body has time the way that everything has time, my story with my body is not written in one single moment. The story with my body is written and is continuing to be written in the way that I exist over time. So I might be overwhelmed now, but is there a space where I can be sensory neutral in an hour from now? Right. In a way that I can remind myself, this is a lot. I will have spaces of that feel more tolerable, and those are coming. And I can remind myself of like me existing over time. So that's coming. I can regulate myself. I can move to that. Yeah. I could say more, but I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, I love that.
Mhm.
So we've got about 4 minutes left,
Mhm.
Hillary. I'm wondering if you would leave us with this a takeaway, a practice, something that we can, whether it's starting with this awareness and making nothing to something, or what's something that we can begin to embody as we continue to move forward in our day-to-day experiences and practice ideas.
So I'm going to try to add a couple things in here in this one practice. The first one being rhythm, the second one being touch. And so I want to invite you, if it feels good for you, you could all adjust how you're sitting or resting. You're welcome to close your eyes if that helps you bring your intention into your internal world. But feel free to look at me or pick some space to look at. And I just invite you to feel the way that you are contacting the floor. If you don't have access to sensation to the floor, you might think about what you are touching. But if your feet are on the floor, I'll just invite you to presence your feet on the floor, maybe pushing down a little bit. And then we're just going to sink into the rhythm of our body. There's actually rhythm happening inside of us and around us and between us all the time. And this is a way of joining with the way that rhythm, it is one of the things that life does. So our heart is beating, our cells are moving and engaging in mitochondrial processes. Like there's a diurnal rhythm, a nocturnal rhythm. There's so many patterns of cycles in our bodies and in the natural world around us. So we just get to remember that rhythm is this thing that animates life or one of the features of life. And so as you're breathing, I'll invite you to push your toes into the ground on your inhale and then pull your toes up and push your heels in on your exhale. And at the start, that might feel like these kind of discrete actions. Toes down while you're inhaling, heels down as you're exhaling. But soon you can start to pay attention to these moments in between as well. The moments in between your inhale and exhale, the moments in between your exhale and your inhale. And seeing people continue to pay attention to the pace and the rhythm of how your feet are pushing into the ground in a way that matches your breath. You might start to notice that what felt a little bit like a binary actually has some more fluidity to it, that your feet end up looking a little bit more like they're rocking. And then instead of your breath being an in and out, it looks a little bit more like a circle or a cycle. We'll just do one more round of that. And then if you find a way to let yourself come to rest, you might just make contact with yourself somewhere. Maybe it's your hands on your chest or your face, or even holding your hand or resting them on your lap if that feels most comfortable. But I invite you to feel some contact with yourself and just say in your own mind, I am my body. Here I am. Just feeling the quality of the touch of your own hands on your body as you meet yourself in this way. Noticing how much pressure and how little pressure you like. And then when you feel all ready, we'll come back to our shared space. Thank you, everybody, for joining me.
Thank you, Hillary. Thank you all. Have a wonderful week.
Thank you.